So, Stephen D here on Pure 24/7 Radio, and I am joined as ever by Bob Goody from Rural Missions. Good morning, Bob.
Good morning, Stephen.
Pleasure to have you back on. How are you doing today?
Yeah, doing well. Yeah, good today. Excited to be able to share with you once more and to be here.
Excellent. Yes. So one of the things I think we alluded to last week was some of the challenges that might be faced in more rural communities. So I thought we'd be talking a bit more about that today. Where do you want to start with that?
I guess for those of you that weren't listening last week, some context. So I lead a Christian charity called Rural Missions. So we help rural churches to think and be more missional. So what does it look like to be in those spaces of rurality and to share Jesus into the midst of that? So I think we talked a little bit about that there are differences between the urban and rural, but actually there are some stark challenges that they face as well. So I think that's probably a good place to start as to some of the unique challenges that our rural churches might face.
Yeah, I'm sure I could probably guess a few, but let's start with what are some of the most noticeable challenges that they might face.
No, I'm really interested, Stephen, because you said you might be able to name a few. What would you say are some of the big challenges?
Well, first thing that comes to mind would be kind of public transport. That is a challenge that I've certainly seen living in the countryside. You can't really rely upon buses, so you kind of have to have a car or you can't get places. That is a challenge. So if you had any kind of event going on, you have to have a car basically to get there. That's, I would imagine, a challenge.
Yeah, for sure. So connectivity is really difficult in a rural community. And I hate to say it, but one of the positives that came out of a few years ago when we had a global pandemic and people were locked away behind doors, probably one of the most horrific moments of the last 50 years of like, how do we do this and all of those during COVID. But actually one of the things that presented itself was that connectivity issue for those in rural communities. And it really brought to light that if you are now stuck in your village, your buses aren't running, the shop's not allowed to open, and sometimes there might not be another shop for 15 to 20 miles, you can't get into a doctor's, that seclusion and that stark contrast of being able to go out and see people in bubbles when there's not really much to bubble around you was really difficult. But one of the positives that came through was that the internet had a real boost in the villages. And I know people that didn't even have dial-up. Some villages didn't have any kind of connection whatsoever. But all of a sudden, this challenge that was there, they suddenly went, okay, I want to be able to talk to my family. I want to see my grandchild that's been born in the last 6 months that I've just not been allowed to go and see or can't get to because of that isolation and that transport network. So there are challenges such as that, but actually the internet has provoked a real bonus into those spaces. And I'm starting to come across more and more churches that during COVID, they ran online. And when you're a church of 12 people, you don't expect that you would run online, and some still do, because even though they are better connected, even though the village is now open, obviously, it is still difficult for the older generation to be able to get out and about, and even up the lane to get to church is still a big issue. So yeah, I would agree. Transport has really brought a segregation that shouldn't really be there.
It's just one of those things in the countryside that you do experience that. Another aspect to transportation is during the winter months, perhaps few roads are gritted as well. So that's another challenge to face. But you mentioned COVID times and how actually out of that, some positive things have come. I've heard a lot of people say that, I mean, through the hard time of the lockdown and the pandemic and all of that, there were some positive things to arise. And you just mentioned one of them.
Yeah. So one of the other challenges that they do face, and one that I come across often, is even though you're in a village and there tends to be a lot of older generation that would be in that village, actually it can still seem very daunting to darken the doors of the church. And so one of the challenges that I see that churches face is people wanting to come into the building. Now, there are ways and means that they can counteract that. I was once in a village in Derbyshire and talking to the church, and they were a church of 12 people. And they started to realize, as we went through our consultation process and how do they share, that people were put off coming to the church because there weren't any street lights. And especially during the winter months when it's dark when it's not dark between like 11 a.m. and 3 p.m., those kind of days, people were too scared, for want of a better expression, to come into church. They couldn't get their head around it. And so they had a carol service at Christmas, and they didn't get as many numbers as they would hope for. So they actually made a simple adjustment with our recommendation, is that there was only one other community space in that entire village. Like, it's a village of around 900. Do you know what the community space was?
A hall?
A pub.
Oh, right.
It was one of the few villages that still has a pub open. So they actually took the agreement that, well, let's move our carol service to the pub. Because, interestingly, everyone seemed to be able to get to the pub. It's a space they knew, but it was more central. Because sometimes the church is on the outskirt or up the hill of a village. And so they moved their carol service to the pub, and they saw their biggest numbers ever for a carol service.
Wow.
But then they started to go, well, maybe there's other things that we should do in this pub. And again, they reflected on how scary it is to go into a random person's house. Like, it's not something we'd all do every day, but they said, well, we believe in small groups during the week, but if someone wants to join one of our small groups, they need to come to Betty's house. And they don't know Betty, and they don't really want to go into a random person's house. They're not willing to come to the church because it's too dark and it costs a fortune to heat it. Well, maybe we'll do the Bible study in the pub. And at the back of the carol service, they started a Bible study in the pub. And that church has grown from 12 people in the last 18 months to 37 people regular in their church.
That's really cool. I love that. Going to a Bible study in a pub. That sounds pretty good to me. But I'd never thought about that, the darker setting. So, I mean, I've lived in the countryside a lot, and I appreciate and actually really enjoy the lack of streetlights. But if you're not used to that sort of thing, you might find it quite daunting, and especially going to a place that isn't well lit. I'd never thought of that. So that's a really interesting thing to come across.
Yeah, I think there are challenges, but there are always opportunities that go alongside. Again, I was talking to a church, and the biggest challenge they faced, they had no toilet. You don't really stop to think, oh yeah, villagers out in the sticks that have been there since Saxon times, like they're hundreds of years old. Maybe they didn't realise they needed to plumb in some toilets and a wash basin and all those kind of things. So one of the big challenges our churches face is people can't necessarily connect in because they can't go to the toilet. And it's crazy how many people I've had conversations with that were like, I'd love to go to church, but if I'm that far from a toilet, I just don't know whether I can manage. And it's a bit of a weird and sad reality in this day and age, because at home and at our church, we toilet twin. And so we paid and we twin our toilet with a place in Malawi. And I think I'm helping to fund that when actually the church up the road don't have a toilet as well. And you don't expect it in this country, I'd say.
That is another odd one, isn't it? Yeah, it's not something you'd expect to come across, but it is obviously a real problem for people, and fair enough. So these real practical solutions, it would seem, to people coming into the church, lighting, toilets, things like that, that are really simple. I mean, you mentioned earlier heating as well, actually. Some of these churches really hard to heat, really expensive to heat, and a cold building isn't something you would really want to go to.
No, we've tried to explore what does it look like to come against some of that challenge, because you're right, heating a church costs a pretty penny.
Yeah.
And oftentimes when you go past, you'll see they're already trying to raise money for the spire that's falling down, or the roof that's had the lead took off it, and all those bits. And so when you think of heating, like in the summer, it's lovely because you get a nice little breeze, you get the warmth. But in the winter, I do know a few churches now that decide, let's heat the body rather than heat the room. So they've moved to these infrared lights. Is it infrared lights, UV lights?
Okay.
So actually you get the warmth on the person, but the whole space remains cold.
Interesting. Okay.
And so that's a good way to be able to do it. But then the challenges they face is some of these churches are so old, they're not allowed to drill into the walls. They're not allowed to put anything up and all of those processes. And they have to go through what is known as a faculty if they're in a Church of England to make any kind of alteration or move anything around their building. And you go, I just want to help people be warm and to know Jesus. Like, why do we have to have some of this rigmarole and faff? But some churches get around it by knitting blankets. I went to one church, they knit blankets and there's a huge pile of them at the back of church. So if you come in for a Sunday service, you can pick up your pew, your Bible, pick up your hymn book and pick up a blanket to keep you warm.
That's one solution. I mean, it doesn't have to be complicated. But I mean, another aspect of this, I suppose, is that the church is more than just the building, isn't it? So when you're talking about how you can help in the community, going to that pub where it is warm and actually going into that community around you that's rural, that's the other way, isn't it?
Yeah. And it's not just the challenges that the church face that are the issue. It's the challenges we as humans face. And whether you live in an urban area, whether you live in a rural, no matter where you live, you probably have some kind of feeling of isolation, of a lack of connection. There used to be a time when I was growing up, a few years ago now, where I knew every person on my street. And if my parents weren't home at the end of school, I knew that I could go to Jane's a couple of doors up and she'd let me in and make me a sandwich, and we just share life together around a street. And I think part of the issue is we've lost the art of connection, both as humans but also in our communities. Even now, I know my neighbour across the road. I know him well. We have good conversations. He's from Poland and we share stories, and he knows that we're praying for him and keep inviting him to church, and he looks after our cat when we go away. But aside from Peter, I don't know how many people on my street I could tell you the name of. And I think there is a reality in urban, but even in rural, I think people have started to close their doors a lot more. And going back to the COVID conversation, I think that had that effect. People are still a bit reluctant to come back out into the space and to get to know one another. So how do you build community back when the community gets shut down is a big challenge.
Yeah, it was something I was talking about with someone recently, actually, how you used to see in villages, you'd have your local post office, your local pub, you'll have maybe a corner shop. There would be a lot more of a community feel, but you're seeing less and less of that. And actually, a lot of villages now are just simply houses. So they'll go elsewhere for their post office or for drinks or any number of other things. So actually, this, as you say, it's happening in urban environments, but you might have thought that rural communities were safe from that, but actually they're not. They're also experiencing some of the same thing, that disconnection.
Yeah. And it looks idyllic. Like, I even talked to my wife and she'd love to go move to a coastal village and be beside the sea every day. But most rural communities are far from idyllic. There is deprivation, there is loneliness, there is isolation. There is all of these issues and more going on behind the scenes. So actually, how do we bring some encouragement into that? And I know on the last conversation we had a couple of weeks ago now, I talked about farmers. And actually, the sad reality is that the mental health rates and suicide rates and things like that in farmers are just crazy as rules change, as things adapt around them. And even a couple of days ago, I had the conversation, farmers, they're so stuck in their ways, they don't change. Actually, they're the most entrepreneurial people you will ever meet. Like, they are changing like there is no tomorrow. I know farmers that within a couple of days have had to change what their crops will be for the next year because the winds have changed, the rain has changed, the climate has done something different. and they've had to diversify and get in different animals and different crops and different ways and means of doing life. But oftentimes they're so busy, they just don't feel that support and that love. And sometimes the only people that come around the door are the government knocking on going, can I check your sheep? And it's like, well, you can, but you're not giving me any money to support them anymore. So there are challenges, there are things that we face, but I wonder if one of the biggest ones is the undervaluing of our rural churches. So I've not come across a village church yet, especially within the Anglican sector, the Church of England, where there is just one vicar towards one church. And there is something quite crazy going on at the minute. The most I've heard was a half-time vicar covering 24 churches.
I've heard of things like that. It's crazy.
Yeah. I know in the city in Nottingham, there is a church that has 9 vicars for the one church. 2 of them are curates and in training, but the rest are all on the staff team. And I go, you 9 could be looking after some incredible churches in our villages. And actually, there is an undervaluing and under-resource that seems to be happening there. But I know it's morning, so I think maybe we need a bit of hope. Like, there are challenges, but there are real spurts of hope in amongst it all as well.
Yeah, let's talk about something a bit more positive then. So we've talked about some of the challenges that they face in rural communities, and how let's share us a story of how you've fixed one of those problems.
So interestingly, when I took over Rural Missions, I took over from the founder. He'd led it for 36 years, and then I've led it now for 2 years. One of the first things I did was change our name. So we were called Rural Mission Solutions. And just as you've said, tell me one that you've fixed. I removed the solutions because, A, we sounded like an IT firm. We're going to come and install broadband. We're a rural mission solution. And I just removed the solutions because whilst we were coming to enlighten, whilst we were coming to inspire and encourage and shed some light on the challenges, but also the things that you could do to stop, start, or change in your area, actually, we weren't there to solve it. We couldn't offer you the solution. There's no magic stick that you can wave and my church will be full or the community will be changed. And so it was up to them to figure out how can we support our community and share Jesus into it. But we do have those stories. I have to say what we do does work. And whilst we've not fixed it, we have seen transformation in so many churches. So yes, the church that's grown from 12 to 37, that's an incredible statistic to have. And not many places celebrate, and I've not heard that on national news anywhere else or even in their diocese. But we are quite gentle in our approach. We want them to make something that's going to work for them. Mm. So recently we were supporting a church and journeying with them a bit, and again, church of 20 people, and they decided to run this consultation day with 2 other churches. So in the room, we had 3 churches that cover the one village, 2 Methodist churches and an Anglican church. And as the conversation happened and we did it all together, and then towards the end of it, we go, break down into your individual churches, and the challenge is 3 things you're going to stop, start, or change. And as they started to mull it through and contemplate, and then they started to share back, the first church shared back and they went, we realise that every other week we run a coffee morning. And that's all we can manage to do. We realise we need to be a bit more intentional in inviting people and offering prayer. But what we'd love everyone else in the room to consider is, could we close our coffee morning and do one together? And then the other church pipes up and said, well, it just so happens one of the 3 things that we thought was we run a coffee morning once a month, and we want to be more intentional in praying for people and offering to invite them to stuff. And we thought maybe we should do this together. And then the third church pipes up and said, well, just so happens we'd love to do that too. And so they all came together completely separate, and said, how can we transform our community, not just for this Methodist or this Methodist or this Anglican, but how do we transform this community in Jesus' name, and how do we do it together as Christians in this space? So they formed what is now known as the Churches on the Moor, and they meet once a week and they do a coffee morning together because they're able to sustain it. They're praying for people, they're inviting people, they're starting to run joint events. And what a beautiful thing to recognize that it's not about my own church, but it's about Jesus in this space.
Wow, that's really cool. I love how, as you say, gentle approach, and they were trying to create something sustainable between the three churches. All of them were doing something very similar, and actually, if they come together, and one of the things that started that, I guess, is communication. They need to communicate with one another. So there's some really cool stuff going on in just that one story, which is really amazing.
Yeah, and just think, what could our churches do if we do things together?
Yeah,
like I have a privilege where I sit on both camps. So I actually am part of a leadership of a urban church and then lead a rural mission agency. And so our church, we're a church of around 2 to 250 at the moment. But we often ask ourselves the question, how do we do this as churches together? Because we have people come and join us, and we've not physically done it, but we have encouraged people. And we often do, is this the church for you? Like, don't just come here because you're starting to see numbers. Don't come here for X, Y, or Z. Actually, what's going to be the best place for you to flourish and for your own ministry to flourish? Because we don't want this consumer kind of church. Mm-hmm. We want a church where people are invested and then invested in sharing Jesus. And so we've had people go and move to other churches, and we want to bless that, encourage that. I don't want it to be about our church growing. I want it to be the whole church growing. So we celebrate and do all of those things. So yeah, no matter what space you're in, there'll always be others that you can partner with and sing about.
Excellent. I think that's a pretty good place to be ending today. Something definitely to be thinking about, actually. Lots and lots of great stuff. Thank you so much for joining us, Bob. It's been a pleasure as always.
Thank you for having me again.
See you next week.